Hi, welcome to my channel. So today I'm going to walk you through how I made historically inaccurate 1760s stays for a Ravenna cosplay that I am working on. Though realistically, you could use these for any sort of like fantasy inspired costume or cosplay. I use this pattern that'll pop up somewhere, and I'll link it down in the description below. I purchased it from Etsy. The pattern is fine. It's okay. However, the sizing is a little weird. So I didn't see any measurements within the pattern to help me pick the right size, and whoever created it put it in European size. I think they're actually French. So they first created it in a European size, and then they converted it to a UK size, and then it was converted to a US size. And it's about 2 sizes too small from my experience. But always make a mock-up and test it first before you make your stays, just to make sure it's the right size. I will say I did not do that. So I had to add an extra panel in the back to act as my eyelet panel, just so that it will fit me. There was no way on earth I was remaking this. So do as I say, not as I do. But other than that, it was a perfectly fine pattern. The instructions were a little confusing, so I hope this video will kind of help you through them if you do attempt to make this pattern. Really, I just wanted to share with you how I made these stays. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and launch on into it. But starting off, I start off sort of after I cut out my fabric and the pattern. So I printed the pattern at home the way that you normally do with a PDF pattern. Super easy. It comes with instructions on how to print it. So there should be no problem there. But my outer fabric, I used a black matte satin from Fabric Wholesale Direct. My inner lining, I used a 10-ounce duck canvas. It's just a super affordable stabilizer that I use in the majority of my corsets. It's way cheaper than using coutil, and I really like the thickness and the stability that it adds. And then my lining is just a plain black cotton. I've already cut out those pieces, and the next step is transferring over the stitch lines from the pattern, so all of the boning channels and the seam allowance. So that is where we will start. After struggling with many different techniques of trying to get these lines onto this canvas, including using a light board that didn't really work because the canvas is too thick, I figured out that this will be the easiest way to migrate the lines over. So I found a line that went from the very top to the very bottom of the pattern piece and cut the piece in half at that line. This will give me the best line to follow for what I'm about to do. Then I lined the pattern back up onto the canvas and traced a line down where I just cut. This is my guide. Then measured the spacing between each of the lines, and it's about 1/4 of an inch. So using my quilting ruler, I lined up the 1/4 of an inch mark onto the guideline and then drew in my next line, creating my first boning channel. And I just did this over and over and over again, keeping the angle the same because I have that guideline to draw out all of the sewing guides needed for this piece. I then did the exact same thing to every other piece of this corset. It did take quite a while. Next, I pinned the canvas to the outer fabric and stitched along all the lines that I had marked, including the seam allowance, leaving the top open. The next step is to pin the front panels together and stitch right along that seam allowance line. And then I ironed the seam flat. I then chose this moment to iron away all of the erasable pin markings to clean up my panel pieces. The next part of this pattern I found difficult to understand, but I think I figured it out in the end. There was a marking on the pattern piece to cut a notch into this side piece here. You take the side back piece and you line up the top stitching line with that tab, which is a bit difficult to do, but I found it easiest to just sort of match up the angles in the photo provided in the pattern, pin that in place, and then stitch along the top seam allowance. Once that's done, you flip it around and line up the edges, pin those in place, and then stitch along the seam allowance. Once again, not going past the angle where the tab sticks out, so just along the straight edge of the pattern pieces. And then I ironed that flat, and you can see it seals off the very top of that boning channel and creates a nice curve for the armhole. So I did that to both sides, and then lined up the sides, the front panels, pin that in place, and stitch them together. Once it's all sewn, I once again ironed these seams open. And finally, I lined up the back panels and sewed those into place as well. Next comes the fun part, trimming up the seam allowance on the bottom of the stays. So I just cut it relatively close to the stitching of the seam allowance, but not so close that I actually cut that thread. And I did that along all panels and cut it up along all tabs, angling the seam allowance on the inside of the corset at the bottom. And just carefully cut around the tabs and cut up to the points so that each tab now moves of its own accord. Once that is done, I pinned together the stay panels and repeated the steps that I did to construct the stays together, pinning it and ironing all of my seams open. Now what I wanted to do was not have to add any edging to the grommet panels. So what I wound up doing here is I pinned my lining to the stays right sides together along the edge of the grommet panel. And then I sewed those together and flipped it inside out, or right side out technically, so that the edges of those panels would fold in. I then ironed those flat so that they would stay in place, and then top stitched along the edge so that that little roll would not fold out. So this is my boning. Zip ties actually have an interesting quality where they act a lot like reed boning. These are smaller though, so they're a little bit more flexible, but with the amount that I'm putting in here, I think it's going to be just fine. So let me show you how I'm going to do this. All you need to do is line up the edge of the boning where you want it to end on the stays, which I did about 1/4 of an inch away from the bottom edge, and I held that in place all the way up, following the boning channel to the top, and sort of marked it with my fingernail about 1/4 of an inch away from the top edge. This is going to give me space on both the bottom and the top to sew on bias tape later. Cut the edge off. Don't come at me for using my nice fabric shears. They are getting sharpened in a couple of weeks at home at, so I was okay using them for the boning. And we're gonna save this extra piece for later. I'm going to use my scissors to round out the corners and then slide it all the way into place, which is a little difficult because the boning channels are a bit snug, so I had to use whatever was around to push that all the way down, leaving about 1/4 of an inch gap between the bottom edge of the stays and the start of the zip tie. So then I just did that for the entire piece, which wound up being, including the little boning channels, 114 zip ties that needed to be slid into the stays, which left me with very sore fingers at the end of this project. And then just for extra safety, I went along the edges of all of the canvas and satin with some fray check to make sure that it wouldn't unravel. For the bottom tabs, I had to take out the stitches that went around the bottom, marking the seam allowance, and slide the boning in from the bottom. Finally, for the 2 pieces of boning at the very edge of the corset that the eyelets will be next to, I did use some spiral steel boning instead, just for some extra security and stiffness. And if you don't know how to cut or cap spiral steel, please check out my video where I cover all of that information. And then I hand stitched the top and the bottom of the lining to the stays and trimmed up the edges of the lining to be flush with the canvas and the satin. And once that's complete, it's just a matter of adding bias tape around the bottom and the top of the stays to hide all of the raw edges, which took an entire day of hand stitching to accomplish. And this is the final result. So yeah, I'm super happy with how it turned out. There's a couple of things that I would actually change. So first of all, I would size it up like I should have done in the first place, but I went with my normal size thinking it would be fine. It was not fine. I would just make a mock-up and then size it up appropriately if I were to do this again. I also would not use 1/4 or 1/2 inch wide double fold bias tape to do my edging. It's what I use for most of my other corsets. However, in this particular case, because of all of the angles in the tabs, it was just incredibly difficult to work that bias tape into those corners. Even when I tried to miter the corners, it was just a lot of fabric to try and shove up into those small spaces. So I would probably use a 1/4 inch bias tape, or I did see another person make stays and they used a strip of like suede or some sort of thin leather, and they stretched and pulled it and worked it around all of those curves, and it turned out really nice. So I'd probably use one of those options instead going forward, but that's okay because I am going to add some nice lace trim over the top of the bottom. The top turned out fine, it's just the bottom. And I have some other bedazzling to do to it, some gems and some metal pieces. And then the entire front will be covered by a decorative warbler plate. So I'm kind of sad that it hides all of that work that I did on the front, but you'll get to see some of the boning around the stays. So I'm actually really happy. My first time ever making 1760 stays, or stays at all, really. It was a lot of work, but not too bad. It probably took me about 20 hours total to make because I had to do a lot of hand stitching and my fingers are incredibly sore and I broke a nail. But other than that, it was fun. It was fun to make those. I've always wanted to, and I finally found a reason to make them. So that's all I have for you today. If you like this video, make sure to hit the like button. Make sure to subscribe for more content like this or to see my other weekly updates. I'm getting very close to finishing Ravenna, and then I'll be making a Tea Party Sailor Cosmos dress. It's somewhat of an original design, and then I'll be going back to my massive competition build of Julieta by Sakizo. So lots more content to come, and until then, I will see you in my next video.